The water was black and moving fast, and Grace Whitmore stood at the edge of the stone bridge with her fingers curled tight around the cold railing. One more step, that was all it would take. One more step and the river would carry away every debt, every shame, every whispered insult that had followed her through the streets of the city for the past 6 months. She closed her eyes and leaned forward. A hand closed around her arm like iron. She gasped and stumbled back, her heel catching on the stone, and she would have fallen anyway if the grip had not been so strong. A man pulled her hard against his chest, and for a moment all she could hear was her own heart slamming against her ribs and the furious rush of the river below. "Are you mad?" His voice was low and sharp, edged with something between anger and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you were about to do?" Grace pushed away from him, her breath coming in short, humiliated gasps. She looked up and found herself staring into the face of a stranger, though not quite a stranger. She recognized the crest on his carriage waiting a few paces away, the black horses standing perfectly still in the fog. Julian Ashford, the Duke of Rowan. She had heard his name spoken in drawing rooms with a mixture of fear and admiration, a man known for his coldness as much as his wealth. "Let go of me," she said, though her voice shook and gave away the lie in her own composure. "So you can throw yourself into the river the moment my back is turned?" His gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. "I think not."
"This is none of your concern, Your Grace."
She spat the title like it tasted bitter in her mouth. "You do not know me." "I know enough. I know that a woman does not stand on a bridge in the middle of the night in December, unless she has run out of other choices." He did not release her arm. If anything, his grip tightened, as though he feared she might bolt for the railing again. "What is your name?" She said nothing. She simply stared at him, this man with his fine coat and his cold eyes, and felt the humiliation of being caught settle over her like a wet blanket. He had seen her at her lowest, most desperate moment, and there was no taking that back. The wind picked up along the bridge, cutting through her thin cloak, and she shivered without meaning to. 6 months ago she had owned a dozen warm coats. 6 months ago she had a house with a fire in every room and a cook who scolded her for skipping breakfast. 6 months ago her father had been alive, and the worst thing she had to worry about was which gloves matched which gown. She had not understood then how quickly a life could be taken apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the clothes on her back and a name that people now said with pity instead of respect. "You are cold," the Duke said, and it was not a question. He shrugged out of his greatcoat and held it toward her. "I do not want your coat. I did not ask whether you wanted it. I am telling you to wear it, because if you collapse from cold on this bridge, I will have to carry you the rest of the way, and neither of us wants that particular scene witnessed by the watchman making his rounds." There was the faintest edge of dry humor in his voice, so slight she almost missed it beneath the sternness. Reluctantly, she took the coat and pulled it around her shoulders. It smelled of cedar and rain, and it was absurdly warm, warmer than anything she had worn in months. She hated how grateful she felt for something so small. "Very well." He sighed, and something in his face shifted, softened just slightly, though the hardness never left his eyes. "You do not have to tell me your name tonight, but I am not leaving you standing here alone. My carriage is just there. I will take you somewhere warm. I do not need your charity. This is not charity. This is common decency, which apparently I possess more of than you credit me with." He finally let go of her arm, but he did not step back. "Walk with me to the carriage, or I will carry you there myself, and I promise you that will draw a great deal more attention than simply walking." Grace clenched her jaw. Every instinct told her to run, to disappear into the fog and never see this man again. But her legs were shaking from cold and exhaustion, and the thought of another night in the abandoned stable where she had been sleeping made her stomach turn. She had nowhere else to go. She had already tried nowhere else to go, and it had led her here, to this bridge, to this moment. She followed him to the carriage. The interior was warm, wrapped in the smell of leather and cedar, and Grace sat as far from him as the small space would allow, her damp cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. The Duke sat across from her, studying her in the dim light of the carriage lamp, and she felt like a specimen pinned beneath glass. "You will stay the night at my townhouse," he said finally. "In the morning, you may leave if you wish. No one will stop you." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. I could be anyone. A thief, a liar." "You could be." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "But I do not think a thief stands on a bridge weeping into the river at midnight. Thieves have better places to be." She looked away, ashamed that he had seen her tears, ashamed that he had seen any of it. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, carrying her further from the bridge and further from the plan she had spent 3 days building up the courage to attempt. Now it lay behind her, unfinished, and she did not know whether to feel grief or relief. "My father was Edmund Whitmore," she said suddenly, surprising herself. She did not know why she told him. Perhaps because the silence had grown too heavy to bear. "Perhaps you have heard the name." The Duke's expression flickered, just slightly. "The banker. Yes. I heard what happened to his accounts. And to him. Then you know there is nothing left. No house, no money, no family willing to claim me. My father is buried in a pauper's grave because I could not afford anything better, and my cousin took the last of what remained before I could stop him." Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. "So no, Your Grace, I am not a thief. I am simply a woman with nothing left to lose, which I have been told makes a person quite dangerous." He was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression she could not read. "What is your cousin's name?" "Why does it matter?" "Because men who steal from grieving women usually make a habit of it, and habits can be broken." His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, and something about the stillness of it frightened her more than shouting would have. "Edmund Voss," she said, "though I doubt there is anything to be done. He has friends in places I could never reach." "There are very few places I cannot reach." He said it simply, without arrogance, as though it were merely a fact of the world, like the color of the sky. Grace studied him carefully, trying to decide if she believed him. The carriage slowed, and through the window she saw the outline of a grand townhouse rising out of the fog, its windows glowing with warm light. It looked like something from a dream she had stopped allowing herself to have. The Duke stepped out first and offered his hand to help her down, and she hesitated only a moment before taking it. Inside, a housekeeper with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner took one look at Grace's soaked clothing and swept her upstairs before she could utter a single protest. Her name was Mrs. Pratt, and she moved through the halls with the quiet authority of someone who had run the household for decades and answered to no one but the Duke himself. She clicked her tongue at the state of Grace's shoes, muttered something about catching a chill, and had a bath drawn within minutes. A bath was drawn, dry clothes were found, and food was brought to a small sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Grace sat wrapped in a warm robe, staring at the flames, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to simply breathe. She traced the rim of the teacup with one finger, half expecting someone to burst through the door and tell her it had all been a mistake, that she did not belong here, that she should return to the cold stable where she had been sleeping. No one came. The fire popped softly, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour, and slowly, cautiously, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. She thought of her father that night, as she always did in quiet moments. He had been a good man led astray by men who were not, men who had used his name and his signature to build schemes he never fully understood until it was too late to stop them. He had died of shame more than illness, she often thought, his heart simply giving out under the weight of ruin he could not undo. Grace had buried him with what little money remained, and within weeks her cousin Edmund had arrived to claim the rest, citing debts she had never seen proof of and papers she had never been allowed to read closely. She had not fought him. She had not known how. She did not see the Duke again until the following morning. He found her in the breakfast room, sitting stiffly at the edge of a chair as though she expected to be told to leave at any moment. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I have a proposal," he said. Grace's spine straightened. "I told you, I do not need charity." "This is not charity. My younger sister requires a companion. Someone with education and manners who can guide her through her first season without the fussing of a hired governess she has already run off twice." He poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements calm and deliberate. "You would have a room in this house, a wage, and respectability restored to your name. In exchange, you would look after Lily and see that she does not embarrass herself or me in society. And what happens when the season ends? We will discuss that when it arrives." He met her eyes, and there was something steady and unshakable in his gaze. Something that made her want to trust him even though every hard lesson of the past year told her not to trust anyone. "I am not asking you to be grateful, Miss Whitmore. I am asking you to be useful. There is a difference." Grace looked down at her hands, at the fine china cup she held, so different from anything she had touched in months. She thought of the river, of how close she had come to letting it take her, and she thought of the strange, cold-eyed man who had pulled her back without knowing her name. "Very well," she said quietly. "I accept." She did not know, sitting there in the pale morning light, that accepting his offer would change everything she thought she understood about danger, about kindness, and about the walls people build to keep themselves from being hurt again. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, she had a reason to see tomorrow. The Duke nodded once, as though the matter were settled and required no further discussion. But as he rose from the table and left the room, Grace caught the faintest shift in his expression, something that looked almost like relief, quickly hidden behind the same cold composure he wore like armor. Neither of them spoke of the bridge again that day. But it stood between them all the same, an unspoken thread now tying two strangers together, and neither one yet understood how tightly it would pull. The scream came from the second floor, sharp and furious, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming so hard the windows rattled. Grace nearly dropped the stack of letters she was carrying as she rushed toward the noise, her heart hammering, half expecting to find some kind of disaster. Instead, she found a girl of 16 sitting on the floor of her bedroom, arms crossed, glaring at a governess who stood trembling near the door. "I will not wear it," the girl announced. "I would rather go to the ball naked than wear that hideous shade of yellow, and you cannot make me. Lady Lily, your brother specifically requested. My brother does not have to wear it, does he?" Grace stepped into the room before the governess could respond, and both of them turned to stare at her. This was the moment she had been dreading since accepting the Duke's proposal 3 days earlier. She had been introduced to Lily only briefly, a stiff curtsy and a suspicious glance, nothing more. "I am told the yellow gown was your mother's favorite color," Grace said carefully, settling herself onto the edge of the bed as though she had all the time in the world. "But I confess, I have never cared for yellow myself. It makes most people look as though they have taken ill." Lily blinked, clearly not expecting this. "That is exactly what I said. There is a green in the shops on Bond Street that would suit your coloring far better. Deep, like moss after rain. It would make every other girl at the ball look washed out beside you." Grace kept her voice light, conversational, the way she used to speak with her own younger cousins before everything fell apart. "Though I suppose if you would rather fight about yellow for another hour, we could do that instead." A reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Lily's mouth. "You are not what I expected." "Neither are you, if I am honest. I was told you had run off 2 governesses. 3, actually. The third one cried so hard she had to be helped into her carriage." Lily said this with obvious pride, and Grace had to bite back a laugh. "Well, I have no intention of crying, and I am considerably harder to frighten than governesses, so you may as well save your energy." Grace stood and offered her hand. "Now, shall we go look at that green fabric before your brother decides we are both hopeless causes?" Lily hesitated, studying her with the same sharp gray eyes that belonged to her brother, though softened by youth and something more open, less guarded. Then she took Grace's offered hand and let herself be pulled to her feet. True to her word, Grace took Lily to the shops on Bond Street that very afternoon, trailed by a maid carrying an armful of ribbons and a footman who looked thoroughly bored by the entire outing. The shopkeeper, a thin woman with sharp eyes for fabric, produced bolt after bolt of green silk until they found the exact shade Grace had described, deep and rich as moss after rain, the kind of color that made a person's eyes seem to glow rather than fade into the background. "It is perfect," Lily breathed, holding the fabric against herself in the mirror. "How did you know?" "I did not know. I guessed, and I was fortunate enough to be right." Grace smiled, watching the girl turn this way and that, clearly imagining herself already at the ball. "Though I will say, you have your brother's coloring. Anything too pale would have washed you out entirely. Do you think he will like it? I think your brother will be far too busy fending off every young gentleman who tries to secure a dance with you to notice the color of your gown at all." Grace kept her tone light, though she meant every word. Lily was going to be a sensation this season, sharp wit and all, and some part of Grace felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness at the thought of strangers circling the girl, weighing her worth by her brother's title rather than her own considerable character. They spent the better part of 2 hours in the shops, and by the time they returned to the townhouse, laughing over some shared joke about a particularly dreadful hat Lily had tried on as a lark, Grace realized she had not thought about the river once. Not the cold water, not the humiliation, not the weight of grief she had carried for months. For the first time since her father's death, she had simply been present, simply been herself, without the constant shadow of what she had lost pressing down on her chest. That evening marked the beginning of something neither of them expected. Over the following 2 weeks, Grace learned the rhythms of the household, the creak of the third stair, the hours when the Duke retreated to his study and did not wish to be disturbed, the particular way Mrs. Pratt hummed when she was pleased with how the house was running. She learned that Lily was clever and quick-tempered but desperately lonely, having lost her mother young and her father shortly after, raised largely by servants and a brother who loved her but did not always know how to show it. She learned other things too, smaller things, the kind that crept up on a person slowly. She learned that the Duke took his coffee black and read the newspaper front to back before anyone else in the house had risen. She learned that he had a habit of rubbing his left temple when he was working through a difficult problem, and that he preferred silence at breakfast but not an uncomfortable one, simply a quiet, companionable stillness that Grace found herself growing to appreciate. She also learned, though she tried hard not to notice it, that he watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking. "You are staring again, Julian," Lily announced one evening at dinner, entirely too pleased with herself. "You have been staring at Miss Whitmore for the better part of 5 minutes." Grace nearly choked on her soup. The Duke's expression did not change, though something flickered behind his eyes, there and gone in an instant. "I was thinking about the accounts," he said evenly. "Nothing more." "You were not thinking about the accounts. You get a very particular look when you think about the accounts, and it is not that one." Lily grinned wickedly, entirely too observant for her 16 years. "I think Miss Whitmore has confused you terribly." "Lily, I am simply making an observation. Make it silently, or make it elsewhere." But there was no real anger in his voice, only the weary patience of an older brother who had long since given up trying to fully control his sister's tongue. He glanced at Grace briefly, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something like embarrassment cross his features before he composed himself again. Grace kept her eyes on her plate, her cheeks burning, and said nothing at all. Later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered down to the library in search of something to read, only to find the Duke already there, seated near the fire with a glass of amber liquid in his hand and an open ledger balanced on his knee. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said, already turning to leave. "You are not disturbing me." He set the ledger aside. "Please, sit, if you wish." She hesitated, then crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite his, the fire casting warm light across the space between them. For a while, neither of them said anything, and the silence was not uncomfortable, only full, heavy with things neither of them was quite ready to say aloud. "Lily likes you," he said finally. "That is not a small thing. She does not like most people. She is a remarkable girl. Sharp and honest in a way that most people lose as they grow older and learn to hide what they truly think." Grace studied the fire rather than his face. "I imagine she gets that from you. I am not certain that is a compliment. It was meant as one." He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly in his hand. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitmore?" "You may ask. I cannot promise an answer." "Fair enough." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "That night on the bridge, was it truly the money? The loss of your father's fortune, your position, all of it?" Grace considered the question carefully, aware that whatever she said next would shape how he saw her from this point forward. "It was everything," she said finally. "The money, yes, but more than that, it was the way people looked at me after, as though I had become invisible and pitiable at the same time, as though the moment my father's name lost its value, I lost mine as well." She met his eyes. "I do not expect you to understand that. You have never had to wonder whether the world would simply forget you existed." Something shifted in his expression, something old and painful surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down. "You would be surprised what I understand, Miss Whitmore." "Then surprise me." He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes, and for a heartbeat she thought he might actually speak of it, whatever it was that made him grow quiet on Sunday mornings and avoid the portrait in the upstairs hall. Then the moment passed, and he shook his head slightly, as though setting the thought aside for another day. "Not tonight," he said. "Perhaps not for a long while yet. Some things are easier carried in silence than spoken aloud, even to someone who might understand them. That is a very lonely way to live." "It is the only way I know." He said it without self-pity, simply as fact, and something in Grace's chest ached at the plainness of it. She recognized the sentiment. She had worn the same armor herself these past months, keeping her grief folded small and private, refusing to burden anyone with the true weight of it. Perhaps that was why, despite his coldness, despite the walls he kept so carefully maintained, she did not find him unkind. She found him familiar, in a way that frightened her slightly. She waited, sensing there was more beneath the words, but he did not elaborate, and she did not press. Instead, they sat together in the firelight a while longer, speaking of small, unimportant things, the kind of conversation that meant nothing and yet somehow meant everything, two people slowly learning the shape of each other's silences. It was well past midnight when Grace finally rose to retire, and as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying." She did not fully understand what he meant by it, whether he spoke of that evening alone or something larger, some deeper gratitude for not having vanished the moment his back was turned that first night. But she carried the words with her up the stairs and into her room, turning them over in her mind long after she had blown out her candle, and for reasons she could not quite explain, she found herself smiling into the darkness. In the days that followed, Grace found herself paying closer attention to the small details of Julian's life, the things a man like him rarely spoke of directly but revealed anyway, in the set of his shoulders or the length of his silences. She noticed the portrait in the upstairs hall that he never looked at directly when passing, a young woman with kind eyes and Lily's same stubborn chin. She noticed how he grew quiet on Sundays, retreating to the small chapel behind the house for an hour, before anyone else in the household had risen. She did not ask about either. Some griefs, she understood better than most, were not meant to be pried open by curious hands. Instead, she found other ways to draw him out, small ones. She began leaving books she thought he might enjoy on the table beside his favorite chair in the library, novels far removed from the ledgers and reports that consumed his days. She teased him gently at breakfast about his refusal to acknowledge good weather, until he had confirmed it with 3 separate sources. Slowly, so slowly she almost did not notice it happening, the space between them began to soften, the careful distance neither of them had meant to close narrowing without either one quite admitting it aloud. Lily noticed it too, of course, because Lily noticed everything, and she took great delight in pointing it out at every possible opportunity, much to her brother's visible discomfort. But beneath the teasing, Grace sensed something else in the girl, something like hope, as though Lily had quietly decided that if anyone deserved a companion who might chip away at her brother's carefully built walls, it was Grace. She did not yet know how much would change in the weeks that followed, how the careful walls both of them had built would begin, slowly and against their better judgment, to crack, or how quickly the fragile peace of the household would be tested by forces neither of them could control. Smoke curled beneath the kitchen door before anyone in the house noticed the smell, and by the time Grace reached the stairs, the entire lower floor was filled with a haze that stung her eyes and burned the back of her throat. Somewhere below, a maid was screaming, and pots were clattering to the floor in a panic that made everything worse rather than better. "Everyone out," Grace shouted, taking command before she had time to think about whether she had any right to. "Now." Through the garden door, not the front hall, the smoke is thicker there. The staff, startled by the authority in her voice, obeyed without question, funneling toward the garden door in a stumbling, coughing line, while Grace held it open and counted heads as they passed. Mrs. Pratt, the scullery maid, the young footman who always looked half asleep, cook, soot-streaked and furious at whatever had gone wrong with the stove. "Where is Lily?" Grace demanded, catching Mrs. Pratt's sleeve. The housekeeper's face went white. "She was upstairs, miss." "In her room, reading, the last I saw of her." Grace did not wait to hear more. She pulled her sleeve up over her mouth and plunged back into the smoke-filled hall, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her eyes streaming, her lungs already protesting the thick gray air. She found Lily in her room exactly where Mrs. Pratt had said, curled in a window seat with a book, entirely unaware of the chaos unfolding below because her door had been closed and the sound had not carried. "Fire," Grace gasped, pulling her to her feet. "Downstairs. We need to move, now." Lily's eyes went wide with fear, but she did not freeze, did not waste precious seconds asking questions. She followed Grace back into the hallway, where the smoke had grown thicker still, curling along the ceiling like something alive. Grace kept one hand wrapped tightly around Lily's wrist, and the other braced against the wall, feeling her way toward the back stairs, rather than risk the smoke pouring up the main staircase. They were halfway down when a beam somewhere below groaned and cracked, and Lily stumbled, coughing so hard she nearly went to her knees. Grace caught her, half carrying her the rest of the way, her own vision beginning to blur from the smoke and the effort. By the time they burst through the garden door into the cold evening air, both of them collapsed onto the grass, gasping and coughing, tears streaming down their soot-stained faces. That was where Julian found them minutes later, having ridden back from a meeting the moment word reached him that smoke had been seen rising from his townhouse. He came through the garden gate at a dead run, and for one terrible moment his eyes swept the gathered staff and found neither his sister nor Grace among them, before he spotted the 2 of them on the grass, alive, breathing, safe. Grace had never seen him move so fast. He crossed the garden in a few long strides and dropped to his knees beside Lily first, checking her over with hands that were not quite steady, murmuring something low and urgent that Grace could not fully hear. Only once he was satisfied his sister was unharmed did he turn to Grace, and the look on his face in that moment stole what little breath she had left. "You went back in," he said, his voice rough. "The house was on fire, and you went back in." She was upstairs. Someone had to. Someone. He repeated the word as though it tasted strange in his mouth. "You could have died, Grace." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, raw and stripped of its usual composure, did something strange to her chest. She wanted to say something clever, something to lighten the moment, but the words would not come. Instead, she simply nodded, too exhausted and shaken to do anything else. He reached out then and brushed a streak of soot from her cheek, his fingers lingering a half-second longer than necessary, and neither of them looked away. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for bringing her back to me." The fire, it turned out, had started from a fallen coal in the kitchen hearth, nothing more sinister than carelessness on a busy evening, and by the time the household physician had checked over both Grace and Lily, declaring them shaken but unharmed, the sky outside had gone fully dark. The damage to the house was contained mostly to the kitchen and the servants' hall, and already Julian was speaking with the staff about repairs, his voice steady again, the careful composure sliding back into place like armor. But something had shifted between him and Grace that could not be undone, and both of them knew it, even if neither spoke of it directly in the days that followed. The morning after the fire, the household moved slowly, everyone still shaken despite the physician's reassurances. Grace woke early out of habit, though her throat still ached faintly from the smoke, and found Lily already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a small, stubborn queen refusing to be told she needed more rest. "You saved my life," Lily said, the moment Grace stepped through the door, no preamble, no easing into the subject the way most people might. "I did what anyone would have done." "No, you did not. Mrs. Pratt told me the smoke was thick enough by the main hall that 2 of the footmen refused to go back in for anything, not even for the silver. You went back in for me." Lily's eyes, so like her brother's, were unusually solemn. "I have had 3 governesses and countless relations pass through this house since our parents died, and not one of them has ever looked at me the way you did last night. Like I mattered more than anything else in that house." Grace crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, unsure how to answer something so earnestly given. "You do matter, Lily. More than you seem to believe some days. Julian thinks so too, you know. He simply does not know how to say it without sounding like he is reading from a ledger." Lily's mouth quirked into something almost mischievous despite the exhaustion still shadowing her face. "But I think you are teaching him. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you in the garden last night." "Lily, I am simply making an observation, as usual." The girl grinned, some of her old spark returning despite the soot still smudged along her hairline, and Grace found herself laughing despite everything, a release of tension she had not realized she was still carrying. Downstairs, the kitchen had already been swept clean of debris, though the smell of smoke lingered stubbornly in the walls, and workmen had been summoned to assess the damage to the servants' hall. Julian moved among them with quiet efficiency, giving instructions, asking after each staff member by name, making certain no one had been overlooked in the chaos of the previous night. Grace watched him from the doorway for a moment before he noticed her, and something about the careful, thorough way he tended to his people, servants included, struck her as entirely unlike the cold, distant reputation that preceded him in society drawing rooms. "You should be resting," he said, catching sight of her at last, his tone gentler than she had ever heard it directed at anyone beyond his sister. "So should you. I find it difficult to rest when there is work to be done." But he crossed the kitchen toward her anyway, studying her face with quiet concern. "How is your throat?" "Improving. Yours?" "The same." A faint, almost shy smile touched his mouth, so unlike his usual composed expression that Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the sight of it. "I have been informed by my sister, at considerable length, that I owe you a debt I cannot easily repay." "You owe me nothing. I would have done the same for any child in danger." "Perhaps, but it was not any child. It was Lily, and you did not hesitate, not for a moment, from what the staff have told me." He held her gaze a beat longer than necessary before seeming to catch himself, clearing his throat and turning back toward the workmen waiting for further instruction. "We will speak more this evening, if you are willing. There are things I find I would like to say to you, when the house is not quite so full of smoke and confusion." Grace nodded, her pulse quickening at the promise in his words, and spent the remainder of the day in a state of restless anticipation she had not felt in longer than she could remember. It was 3 evenings later, once the worst of the repairs had begun and the household had settled back into something resembling its usual rhythm, that Grace finally found herself alone with him again in the garden after Lily had retired for the night, and worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting on her tongue since that first night in the library. "The portrait in the upstairs hall," she said carefully, watching his face for any sign that she had overstepped. "The young woman with Lily's chin. Who was she?" For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, that he would retreat behind the same careful silence he always used to guard the more painful corners of himself. But instead, he let out a slow breath and settled onto the garden bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air. "My mother," he said. "She died when I was 12. Lily does not remember her at all. She was only an infant. But I remember everything. The sound of her laugh. The way she used to read to us in the evenings, doing all the voices herself, no matter how ridiculous she sounded." A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. "My father was never the same after. He grew cold, distant, buried himself in the estate and the title until there was nothing left of the man my mother had loved. I suppose I learned from him how to survive loss, wall it off, keep moving forward, never let it show. That sounds like a very hard way to grow up. It was the only way I knew." He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering behind his usual composure. "When my father died 5 years ago, I inherited the title, the estate, and Lily, all at once, with no warning and precious little preparation. I was terrified I would fail her the way our father failed us, that I would become cold and distant too buried in duty to notice she needed someone warmer than a ledger and a title." "You have not failed her," Grace said it firmly, without hesitation. "She adores you. Anyone with eyes can see that." "She adores you as well," he said, and something in his tone made her heart skip, "more than I think you realize. You have given her something I could not, these past weeks. Warmth. Someone who teases her and challenges her and does not simply manage her like a problem to be solved." Grace looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to the quiet intensity of his words. "I only did what felt natural. That is precisely why it matters so much." He turned toward her fully now, and the space between them felt suddenly very small. "Grace, I need to tell you something, and I am not entirely certain how." Her breath caught. "Then simply say it." "That night on the bridge, I have told myself a dozen different stories about why I stopped, why I could not simply ride past a stranger and continue on my way, as any sensible man would have done." He held her gaze, steady despite the raw honesty in his voice. "I have come to understand it was not simple decency, though I told myself that at the time. Something in me recognized something in you, some shared understanding of grief and survival that I could not name then, and am only beginning to name now. Julian." His name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue, the first time she had spoken it aloud. "I am not asking anything of you," he said quickly, as though suddenly aware he had said too much. "I know your circumstances are complicated, that you came to this house out of necessity rather than choice. I would not have you feel obligated to. Julian." She reached out and touched his hand, silencing him. "I am not here out of obligation. Not anymore." Something shifted in his eyes, hope warring with the same careful caution that governed everything he did. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them charged with everything unspoken, everything neither of them had quite dared to admit until this fragile, firelit evening. "I do not know what happens next," she admitted softly. "I have spent so long simply surviving each day that I hardly remember how to want something beyond that. But I find, sitting here with you, that I want more than survival. I had almost forgotten that was possible." "Then let us discover it together," he said, "one day at a time, without rushing toward answers neither of us is ready to give." His thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, a small gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading up her arm. "I am not a man who says such things easily, Grace. I have spent 5 years building walls I believed necessary to protect this family. You are the first person who has ever made me question whether those walls were protecting me, or simply keeping me alone. Walls can be rebuilt lower, you know. They do not have to come down entirely to let in a little more light. That is a remarkably generous way of looking at it. I have had a great deal of practice rebuilding things lately." A small wry smile crossed her face, though there was no real bitterness in it, only the quiet acknowledgement of a hard road walked and, perhaps, finally beginning to ease. "I do not expect you to change overnight, Julian. I would not trust it if you did. But I am willing to sit here in the garden with you, evening after evening, and see what grows in whatever space we manage to clear between us." He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded and almost boyish breaking through his usual composure, an expression she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. I find myself looking forward to it, more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long while. Then, from somewhere inside the house, a bell rang, summoning them both back to the ordinary business of the evening, and the moment broke, gently, like a held breath finally released. Julian stood first and offered his hand to help her rise, and though the conversation ended there, something had irrevocably changed in the space between them, a quiet understanding neither of them was yet ready to name aloud, but both of them carried with them all the same. Grace climbed the stairs to her room that night, with her heart full in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, dangerous and warm and utterly unfamiliar. She paused at her window, looking out over the darkened garden where they had sat only minutes before, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future that did not begin and end with mere survival. She did not yet know that even as this fragile new understanding bloomed between them, a letter was already making its way toward the townhouse, sealed with a signature she would recognize instantly and dread completely, one that would drag the darkest parts of her past directly into the fragile peace she had only just begun to build. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy who refused to wait for a reply and vanished down the street before Mrs. Pratt could even ask his name. Grace recognized the handwriting the instant she saw it, cramped and slanted and unmistakably her cousin's, and her stomach dropped before she had even broken the seal. "Dear cousin," it began, with false warmth that made her skin crawl. "I understand you have found yourself a comfortable new arrangement. How fortunate for you. I do hope the Duke of Rowan is aware of the full circumstances surrounding your father's affairs before he extends his hospitality further. It would be a shame for such generosity to be misplaced. I will call upon you Thursday next to discuss matters further. I trust you will receive me with the courtesy family deserves. Edmund Voss." Grace read it 3 times before the words fully settled, cold and sharp in her chest. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her sleeve, though her hands were not entirely steady, and spent the rest of the morning moving through her duties with a distracted unease that Lily noticed almost immediately. "You have gone very quiet," Lily observed over their afternoon lesson, watching Grace stare unseeing at the pages of a book neither of them had actually been reading for the past several minutes. "I am simply tired." "You are lying, but I will allow it for now." Lily set aside her needlework, studying Grace with the same unsettling perceptiveness she had inherited from her brother. "Does this have anything to do with the letter that boy delivered this morning?" Grace's head snapped up. "You saw that?" "I see everything in this house. It is rather my only entertainment most days." Lily's teasing tone faded, replaced by something more serious. "You should tell Julian, whatever it is. It is a family matter. Nothing that concerns your brother. Everything that concerns you concerns my brother now. Surely you have noticed that much." Lily's words landed with more weight than she perhaps intended, and Grace found she had no answer that did not feel like a lie. She did not tell him that evening, nor the following day. She told herself she was protecting him from unnecessary trouble, that she could manage Edmund on her own the way she always had, but the truth was closer to shame than protection. She did not want Julian to see the parts of her past that Edmund threatened to expose, the humiliating details of debts and accusations she had never fully understood herself. She had only just begun to feel like more than a cautionary tale in his eyes, and she was terrified of what his face might look like if that changed. Thursday arrived gray and cold, matching Grace's mood exactly, and Edmund Voss arrived precisely on time, dressed in fine clothes that did nothing to disguise the calculating gleam in his eyes. Mrs. Pratt showed him into the small sitting room where Grace waited alone, having insisted, over the housekeeper's clear disapproval, that she would receive him privately. "Cousin." Edmund's smile was thin and unpleasant, the same smile she remembered from the day he had come to claim what remained of her father's estate, picking through her grief like a man sorting through goods at a market stall. "You look well. Considerably better than the last time I saw you, in fact. This arrangement suits you. Say what you came to say, Edmund. Straight to business. How refreshing." He settled into a chair without invitation, entirely too comfortable in a house that was not his own. "I have come to discuss an outstanding matter. Your father's debts were never fully settled, you understand. There remain certain obligations attached to his estate, obligations that, as his only living heir, technically fall to you. There is nothing left. You took everything months ago. I took what was owed to me, which is not the same thing at all." His eyes swept the room, cataloging the fine furnishings, the evidence of wealth surrounding her now, though it seems you have found yourself a rather generous new benefactor. I wonder what the Duke would think, knowing the full extent of your father's disgrace, the falsified accounts, the investors who lost everything trusting his name. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Those accusations were never proven. Proven or not, a whisper in the right ears could be quite damaging, particularly to a man as concerned with reputation as the Duke of Rowan is rumored to be. Edmund's smile widened, cruel and satisfied. I am not an unreasonable man, cousin. A modest sum, paid quietly, and I see no reason such unpleasant rumors need ever reach his ears at all. Grace rose from her seat, unwilling to remain sitting while he loomed over her with that satisfied smirk. You forget, Edmund, that I lived in that house too. I saw the ledgers before you burned half of them. I know precisely how much of my father's ruin came from his own poor judgment, and how much came from men like yourself, circling the moment his fortunes turned, eager to claim whatever scraps remained before the vultures got there first. Something flickered across Edmund's face, quickly smoothed over, but Grace had seen it, a flash of unease that told her she had struck closer to truth than he wished to admit. You are hardly in a position to make accusations, cousin. Not when your own future depends so entirely on the goodwill of a man who barely knows you. He knows me considerably better than you ever bothered to. Does he? Edmund's eyes glittered with something cruel. Does he know about the debts your father left unpaid to half the merchants in this city? Does he know you sold your mother's jewelry to a pawnbroker on Fleet Street to afford a single month's lodging before you found yourself, quite conveniently, dragged from a river by a duke? Some might call that fortunate. Others might call it rather too convenient to be entirely accidental. The insinuation landed like a slap, and Grace felt her composure crack for the first time since he had arrived. You dare suggest I planned that night? I suggest nothing. I merely wonder what conclusions others might draw, should the full story reach the right ears. He straightened his cuffs with maddening calm, clearly enjoying the effect his words had produced. You are asking me to pay you to keep quiet about lies. I am asking you to protect the comfortable position you have found yourself in. Call it whatever pleases you. He rose, straightening his coat with irritating precision. Consider my offer carefully, Grace. I will return in 1 week's time for your answer. I do hope, for your sake, it is the sensible one. He left as smoothly as he had arrived, and Grace remained sitting in the small parlor long after the door closed behind him, her hands trembling now that there was no one left to see it. She understood, with sick clarity, exactly what Edmund was doing. He had no true claim on her, no legitimate debt to collect. He simply understood that a whisper of scandal, true or false, could unravel everything she had begun to build, and he intended to profit from that fear for as long as she allowed it. She did not notice Julian standing in the doorway until he spoke. How long has this been happening? Grace startled, her head snapping up to find him there, his expression unreadable, dangerously still in a way she had learned meant he was working hard to control something beneath the surface. You heard. Enough of it. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. How long, Grace? The letter arrived Tuesday. She swallowed hard, bracing for whatever came next, certain she would see the same calculating suspicion in his eyes that she had feared since Edmund's first threat. I should have told you sooner. I did not want you to think. To think what? That you have a difficult family member attempting to extort money through baseless threats? Something sharp flashed in his eyes, though it was not directed at her. Grace, I do not care about rumors regarding your father's affairs. I care that a man walked into my house and threatened someone under my protection, and that you felt you had to face it alone. I did not want to burden you. You are not a burden. His voice softened, though the tension in his shoulders remained. You have not been a burden since the moment I pulled you off that bridge. I need you to understand that, truly understand it, because I suspect it is a lesson someone should have taught you a long time ago. Grace felt her eyes sting, unexpected and overwhelming. Edmund said he would return in a week for my answer. Then he will find one waiting for him, though not the one he expects. Julian's expression hardened into something Grace had not seen before, cold and precise, the look of a man accustomed to solving problems with the full weight of his resources behind him. I have solicitors who specialize in exactly this sort of matter, and connections that extend considerably further than your cousin's petty schemes. Whatever proof he believes he holds over your father's name, we will examine it thoroughly, and I promise you, Grace, we will not simply hand him money to disappear quietly. You would do that? For me? I would do considerably more than that, see you. The words hung in the air between them, quiet but absolute, and something in his tone told her he meant them completely. Relief and something warmer, something she did not yet dare name, flooded through her all at once. But even as she allowed herself to lean into the comfort of his certainty, A small, cautious part of her wondered what Edmund would do when his first attempt failed, and whether a man that desperate would truly retreat quietly into the shadows he had crawled from. The following morning, Julian summoned his solicitor, a precise, gray-haired man named Mr. Ellery, who had managed the family's affairs for over a decade and possessed a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on relentless. He listened to the full account of Edmund's visit without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather book, his expression giving away nothing. "The accusations against your father were investigated at the time, were they not?" Mr. Ellery asked, turning his sharp eyes toward Grace. "Briefly. Nothing was ever formally proven, though the damage to his reputation was done regardless. Most of the investors chose to settle privately, rather than pursue the matter through the courts. Which means there is likely no legal claim your cousin can bring against you directly, only the threat of reputation, which is considerably harder to substantiate and considerably easier to dismantle, provided we act carefully." Mr. Ellery closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I will look into Mr. Voss's own affairs as well, Your Grace. Men who resort to this manner of pressure rarely have entirely clean hands themselves. It would not surprise me to find something useful in his own dealings." "Do whatever is necessary," Julian said. Quietly, if possible, but thoroughly regardless. After the solicitor departed, Grace found Lily waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, clearly having eavesdropped on at least part of the conversation despite her brother's repeated attempts to keep her occupied elsewhere during difficult discussions. "Is it true?" Lily asked without preamble. "Someone is trying to hurt you?" "Someone is trying to frighten me," Grace corrected gently. "There is a difference, and your brother is making certain the second does not happen." "Good." Lily's chin lifted with fierce determination that reminded Grace so strongly of Julian it nearly made her smile despite the tension of the day. "Because you saved my life, and I will not simply stand by while some horrible cousin tries to ruin yours. If Mr. Ellery needs help investigating anything, I am an excellent eavesdropper. I have had years of practice." "I will keep that in mind," Grace said, and this time she did smile, grateful beyond words for the fierce loyalty this girl had offered her so freely, so completely, in the short weeks since they had met. That night, sleep proved elusive. Grace lay awake turning over every possible outcome, every way Edmund's schemes might unravel the fragile peace she had only just begun to build. She thought of her father, of the quiet dignity he had maintained even as his world collapsed around him, and wondered if she possessed even a fraction of that same strength. She thought of Julian's steady voice promising her she was not a burden, and clung to the memory of it as though it were a lifeline thrown across dark water. She did not yet know that Edmund, frustrated and impatient after his first attempt had failed to produce immediate results, had already begun plotting a second approach, one considerably more dangerous than a simple letter delivered to a cousin's door. She was right to wonder what he would do next, because 3 days later, a very different kind of letter arrived at the townhouse, this one addressed not to Grace, but to Julian himself, and its contents would threaten to unravel everything far more dangerously than Edmund's petty demands ever could. The letter sat unopened on Julian's desk for nearly an hour before he finally broke the seal, some instinct warning him that whatever it contained would not be pleasant. He was right. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful and deliberate, clearly meant to appear anonymous, though the content made its author's identity fairly obvious within the first 2 lines. It claimed that Grace Whitmore had orchestrated her own rescue from the bridge, staging the entire scene to secure the attention and protection of a wealthy, unmarried duke. It claimed she had a history of manipulating vulnerable men for financial gain, citing a broken engagement from before her father's ruin that had, in truth, ended for reasons entirely unrelated to any manipulation on her part. It suggested, in carefully worded insinuation, that the Duke of Rowan had been thoroughly deceived by a calculating woman, skilled at appearing helpless. Julian read it twice, his jaw tightening with each line, before setting it down with controlled precision that belied the fury building beneath his composed exterior. He recognized the strategy immediately for what it was, a coward's attempt to poison a well he could not otherwise contaminate, and he had no intention of allowing it to work. He found Mr. Ellery within the hour and set the letter before him without comment. "Edmund Voss," the solicitor said after reading it through, not a question. "This has his fingerprints all over it, though he has been careful enough not to sign his name. I want to know everything about this man within the week, his debts, his associates, his own history of manipulating vulnerable people for financial gain. Since he seemed so fond of the accusation, Julian's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath it now. And I want it done quietly enough that Grace does not learn of this particular letter unless it becomes strictly necessary. She has carried enough weight from that man already. Mr. Ellery proved as thorough as his reputation suggested. Within 4 days, he returned with a folder considerably thicker than Julian had anticipated, containing a history of Edmund Voss's own debts, mounting steadily over the past 2 years, along with records of at least 2 prior instances where he had attempted similar schemes against distant relations, extracting quiet payments in exchange for suppressing rumors that, upon investigation, proved almost entirely fabricated. "He is drowning in his own debts," Mr. Ellery explained, laying out the documents across Julian's desk. "The estate he claimed from Miss Whitmore's father has already been mostly spent, badly managed and worse invested. He needs money quickly, and blackmail has apparently become his preferred method of acquiring it. Then we will make certain he understands the considerable difference between threatening a defenseless woman and threatening someone under my protection." Julian's eyes moved over the documents with cold, methodical focus. "Prepare everything. I want him to understand fully what he is facing before he has the chance to do any further damage." It was Lily, of all people, who first alerted Grace that something significant had shifted in the household's quiet rhythm. She found Grace in the garden 2 days later, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Julian has been locked in his study with Mr. Ellery for 3 days, she announced. "And this morning I overheard him tell the footman to prepare the carriage for a call on Lord Barrow, and he looked positively furious the entire time. I think something is about to happen." Grace's stomach tightened with a mixture of hope and dread. She had not been told the details of whatever Julian and his solicitor had uncovered, only that they were handling the matter, and the not knowing had worn at her more than she cared to admit. "Do you know where he has gone?" "To confront Edmund, I believe, though he would not say so directly, of course. He never tells me anything interesting." Lily's eyes gleamed with the particular delight of a 16-year-old caught up in a drama she considered thoroughly entertaining, despite the real danger underlying it. "I do hope he lets me watch, when it finally happens. I sincerely doubt that will be permitted." "No," Lily sighed dramatically. "I suppose not." Julian returned late that evening, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the drawing room where Grace had been waiting, unable to focus on anything beyond the anxious churn of her own thoughts. He crossed the room directly to her, taking both her hands in his before he had even removed his gloves. "It is done," he said. "Edmund Voss will not trouble you again. What did you do?" "I gave him a choice." Julian's voice remained calm, though something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, the memory of a confrontation clearly still fresh. "He could withdraw every threat, every claim against your father's name, sign a full retraction witnessed by Mr. Ellery, and disappear quietly from London, or I could ensure that every debt he currently owes across this city was called in simultaneously, along with a full account of his own history of extortion, delivered directly to every family he has previously targeted." He chose to withdraw. He chose to withdraw. A faint, grim satisfaction touched Julian's mouth, though not before he tried, rather pathetically, to argue that his claims held some merit. "I informed him that whatever merit they held mattered considerably less than the fact that I now possessed documented proof of 2 prior instances where he had extorted money from grieving relations using nearly identical tactics. Men of business who had trusted him, who he had also cornered with threats of exposure over debts that, upon closer inspection, were entirely invented. He grew considerably less confident once he understood I had done my research as thoroughly as he had failed to do his." "What did he say, when he realized he had lost?" "He blustered a great deal about family loyalty and the unfairness of powerful men crushing those beneath them, which I confess I found almost impressive given the source." Julian's mouth twitched with dark amusement. "I reminded him that loyalty is not typically demonstrated by threatening one's own cousin with fabricated scandal for personal profit, and that if he wished to discuss unfairness, he might reflect on exactly whose grief he chose to exploit twice over, first through theft and now through blackmail." "And the debts? The other families he threatened?" "Mr. Ellery is quietly informing them now, so that Edmund cannot simply relocate to a different corner of the city and begin the same scheme again with fresh victims. I imagine his reputation in London will not survive the week intact." Julian's expression softened as he studied her face, searching for any lingering fear. "He signed the papers not 2 hours ago, in front of witnesses who will make certain he honors them. Your father's name has been publicly cleared of the worst accusations, and Edmund Voss has left London for the countryside, considerably poorer and thoroughly humbled." Relief crashed over Grace so suddenly her knees nearly buckled, and Julian caught her, steadying her against his chest without hesitation. For a long moment, she simply stood there, absorbing the reality that the shadow following her for months had finally, truly lifted. "Thank you," she whispered against his coat. "I do not know how to properly thank you for this. You do not need to thank me." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly, his hands still resting warm and steady on her arms. "Grace, I need to tell you something, and I find I can no longer wait for a more convenient moment to say it." Her heart began to pound. "Then say it." "These past weeks with you in this house have shown me something I had convinced myself I no longer wanted, or perhaps no longer deserved. After everything my father's coldness taught me to expect from myself." He held her gaze steadily, stripped of every careful wall he usually kept so firmly in place. "I love you, Grace, not out of obligation, not out of pity for the woman I pulled from that bridge, but because you are the bravest, most quietly extraordinary person I have ever known, and I cannot imagine this house, or my life, without you in it." The words landed with such raw honesty that Grace found herself momentarily speechless, tears blurring her vision as months of careful self-protection finally, fully gave way. "Julian, I—" But before she could finish, the drawing room door burst open, and Lily stood there, breathless and wide-eyed, clearly having run the entire length of the hall. "There is someone here," she said urgently. "Lord Barrow. He says it is a matter of grave importance, and he insists on speaking with you immediately, Julian. He would not even let me announce him properly." Julian's expression shifted instantly, the warmth of the previous moment giving way to wary alertness. Lord Barrow was a distant cousin, ambitious and calculating, a man who had made no secret over the years of his interest in Julian's title and fortune, particularly given that Julian remained unmarried and childless, leaving the succession technically open to distant claims should anything unfortunate befall him. "Send him in," Julian said, though his jaw had tightened considerably, and he positioned himself slightly in front of Grace, an instinctive, protective gesture she noticed immediately. Lord Barrow swept into the room moments later, a tall, sharp-featured man whose smile never quite reached his calculating eyes. He took one look at Grace, still visibly emotional, standing close beside Julian, and something like satisfaction crossed his features. "I see I have interrupted something," he said smoothly. "How fortunate for me. It saves me the trouble of explaining precisely why I have come. Say your business, Barrow, and be quick about it." "Very well." Lord Barrow's gaze slid deliberately toward Grace. "It has come to my attention that you have installed a young woman of questionable reputation in your household, under the flimsiest of pretenses regarding your sister's companionship, a woman whose father, I am reliably informed, ruined half the investors of this city before his rather convenient death. I wonder, cousin, what the family council would make of such an arrangement, particularly given how it might reflect on your judgment, and by extension, your fitness to continue holding a title that others in this family have waited rather patiently to see properly managed." The threat, thinly veiled beneath formal language, hung heavy in the room. Grace felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately what Lord Barrow was truly suggesting, that Julian's association with her could be used as ammunition to question his standing, perhaps even his control of the very title and estate that protected them all. "You would threaten a formal challenge," Julian said slowly, "over a companion in my household. I would raise concerns any reasonable member of this family might raise, given the circumstances." Lord Barrow's smile sharpened. "Unless, of course, you were to reconsider the arrangement. Send the woman away quietly, and I see no reason such concerns need ever reach the wider family council at all." Grace's heart pounded as she watched Julian's face, waiting for some sign of what he would choose, terrified that the price of loving her had suddenly become far steeper than either of them had anticipated. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable, before Julian finally spoke, his voice low and absolutely unshakable. "No." Lord Barrow blinked, clearly not expecting such an immediate, unequivocal answer. "I beg your pardon? I said no. I will not send her away. Not now, not ever, regardless of what threats you or the family council choose to raise." Julian stepped forward, putting himself fully between Barrow and Grace, his voice gaining strength and certainty with every word. "If you wish to challenge my fitness to hold this title, you are welcome to try, and you will find I have considerably more resources and considerably more support among the family than you currently credit me with. But you will not use Grace Whitmore as a weapon in whatever petty ambition drives you, because I intend to marry her, and no council, no whispered scandal, and no distant cousin hungry for a title he has no rightful claim to will change that." The room fell utterly silent. Grace stared at Julian, certain she had misheard him, certain the words could not possibly mean what her racing heart desperately wanted them to mean. Lord Barrow's composure finally cracked, fury and disbelief warring across his features before he mastered himself enough to offer a stiff, furious bow. "You will regret this decision," he said coldly, before turning on his heel and storming from the room, leaving the front door to slam shut behind him with a force that echoed through the entire house. For a long moment, no one in the drawing room spoke. Then Lily let out a whoop of pure delight, entirely unbefitting a proper young lady, throwing her arms around both of them at once, and Grace finally allowed herself to laugh through the tears still tracking down her face, overwhelmed by a happiness so complete, she hardly knew what to do with it. "Did you mean it?" she asked Julian later, once Lily had been persuaded, with considerable reluctance, to retire for the night and leave them alone once more. "What you said to Barrow, about marrying me. I have never meant anything more completely in my life." He took her hands again, his eyes warm and utterly certain in a way she had never seen from him before. "I know this has not been a conventional courtship, Grace. I know you deserve flowers, and proper courting, and time to simply decide what you want without a room full of chaos deciding it for you first. But I find I cannot wait any longer to ask you properly. Will you marry me?" Grace looked at him, at this careful, guarded man who had pulled her from a river, and slowly, patiently, taught her that survival could give way to something far richer, and felt every last wall she had built around her own heart crumble away completely. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian, I will." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with the full weight of everything neither of them had dared say aloud until tonight, and somewhere beyond the drawing-room windows, the city moved on entirely unaware that two broken, careful people had just chosen, fully and without reservation, to build something whole together. But even as joy filled the townhouse that night, Lord Barrow's furious departure lingered like a shadow neither of them could fully dismiss, a promise of trouble yet to come, that would test their newfound happiness, before it had even the chance to properly begin. The summons from the family council arrived exactly 9 days after Lord Barrow's furious departure, delivered by a formal messenger who insisted on watching Julian break the seal in person, as though the family expected him to burn the letter unread rather than face whatever accusations it contained. Julian read it once, his expression carefully neutral, before passing it to Grace without comment. The council had convened at the request of Lord Barrow to discuss, in the letter's careful legal language, matters pertaining to the Duke of Rowan's judgment and conduct that certain family members believed warranted formal review. Grace was named directly, though not by title, only as a woman of questionable background whose presence in the ducal household had raised concerns among family members responsible for protecting the integrity of the title. "They cannot simply remove you," Grace said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty she could not fully suppress. "Surely there is no legal mechanism for that." "No, there is not. Not while I remain of sound mind and unmarried by choice rather than incapacity." Julian's jaw was set, though his eyes remained steady, betraying none of the panic Grace felt churning in her own chest. "But a formal council review, even one that ultimately finds nothing actionable, can still do considerable damage. Whispers become printed gossip becomes assumption, and assumption, repeated often enough among the right circles, becomes something very difficult to undo, regardless of whether it was ever true. Then perhaps I should withdraw, return to a quiet life somewhere far from London, before my presence causes you any further." "Do not finish that sentence." Julian's voice cut through hers, sharp enough that Grace fell silent immediately. He crossed the room and took her hands in his grip firm and grounding. "I have already told Lord Barrow in front of witnesses that I intend to marry you. I meant every word. I will not undo that promise, because a council of distant relations with more ambition than affection decides to make things difficult. We will face this together, as we intend to face everything from this point forward." The council met 3 days later in a grand, cold room at the family's ancestral seat outside London, a place Grace had never visited and hoped never to see again after this particular ordeal concluded. She sat beside Julian, dressed in her finest remaining gown, her spine straight despite the anxious flutter in her chest, while a dozen distant relations, some kind-eyed, most simply curious, and Lord Barrow himself, sharp and self-satisfied at the head of the table, prepared to hear the matter formally addressed. Lord Barrow spoke first, laying out his concerns with practiced eloquence, painting a picture of a duke led astray by grief and misplaced sympathy, into an entanglement unworthy of the family name. He spoke of Grace's father's ruined reputation, conveniently omitting any mention that the accusations had since been formally retracted. He spoke of the impropriety of installing a stranger, however sympathetically found, within a household containing an unmarried young woman not yet fully out in society. He spoke, at considerable length, of duty and legacy, and the careful stewardship a title such as this demanded. When he finally finished, Julian rose, calm and measured, and addressed the room directly. I will not waste this council's time disputing every insinuation Lord Barrow has raised, as most of them dissolve entirely under the slightest scrutiny. He produced a folder from beneath his arm and set it on the table. This contains the formal retraction, signed and witnessed, from Edmund Voss himself, confirming that the accusations against Miss Whitmore's late father were fabricated for the purpose of extortion, along with documented evidence of 2 prior instances of identical schemes conducted against other families represented, I believe, by several people seated at this very table. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Several council members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recalling their own dealings with Edmund Voss with newfound suspicion. As for Miss Whitmore's presence in my household, Julian continued, I invite anyone here to speak with my sister directly, who will confirm that in the weeks since Miss Whitmore joined our household, she has shown nothing but courage, kindness, and considerable personal risk on Lily's behalf, including running into a burning kitchen to ensure my sister's safety while others hesitated. His eyes swept the table, landing finally on Lord Barrow with cold, deliberate precision. I understand this council's genuine concerns regarding the family's reputation, and I respect the seriousness with which most of you approach that responsibility. But I do not believe those concerns are what brought us here today. I believe ambition brought us here today, dressed carefully in the language of duty. Lord Barrow's face flushed with barely controlled fury. You overstep, cousin. Perhaps. But I would rather overstep in defense of the woman I intend to marry than sit quietly while my family is manipulated into questioning her worth based on lies a desperate man invented for profit. Julian's voice remained level, but there was steel running through every word. I will marry Grace Whitmore, with or without this council's blessing. I would prefer to have it, out of respect for the family we both belong to. But I will not be dissuaded by threats disguised as procedure, and I suspect several of you, upon honest reflection, understand precisely what has truly been occurring here today. An older woman near the far end of the table, whom Grace would later learn was Julian's great-aunt and among the most respected voices in the family, spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I have known Lord Barrow's ambitions regarding this title for some years now, she said, her voice dry and pointed. I confess I find this entire proceeding considerably less about propriety, and considerably more about opportunity. Julian has provided documented proof refuting every substantive concern raised today. I move that this council formally close the matter, with our full confidence in the Duke's judgment restored. The motion carried with surprising speed, most of the council clearly relieved to abandon a proceeding that had grown increasingly uncomfortable under Julian's steady rebuttal. Lord Barrow left the estate that afternoon without another word, his ambitions thoroughly, publicly dismantled, and Grace suspected, correctly, that they would not hear from him again. In the weeks following the council's decision, life at the townhouse settled into something Grace had never quite dared to imagine for herself. A steady, ordinary happiness built from small moments rather than grand gestures. Mrs. Pratt took to humming constantly now, pleased beyond measure at the prospect of a wedding to plan, and the household staff, who had watched Grace's transformation from frightened stranger to beloved fixture of the family, threw themselves into the preparations with genuine warmth rather than mere duty. Lily predictably appointed herself in charge of everything, drafting lists of flowers and menus with the same fierce determination she applied to every project she cared about, and Grace found herself laughing more in those weeks than she had in years, swept along by the girl's boundless enthusiasm. You will be my sister properly now, Lily said one afternoon, helping Grace choose ribbon for the wedding favors, her tone suddenly softer than her usual teasing brightness. Not just my companion, not just someone Julian is fond of, my actual sister. I already felt that way, Grace admitted, long before your brother ever said a word about marriage. I know, Lily smiled, quiet and genuine. That is rather why I approve so completely. There were quieter moments too, evenings spent in the garden where Julian and Grace continued the slow, unhurried practice of learning each other fully, sharing stories neither had spoken aloud in years. Julian told her, finally and fully, about his father's decline after his mother's death, the cold distance that had settled over the household like a permanent winter, and how desperately he had feared repeating that same pattern with Lily. Grace told him about her own mother, gone since childhood, and the quiet strength her father had shown raising her alone before the schemes of dishonest men had unraveled everything he built. We are both, I think, people who learn to survive alone, Julian observed one evening, his hand resting warm over hers on the garden bench. I am grateful, more than I know how to properly express, that we no longer have to. Word of Edmund Voss reached them only once more before the wedding, a brief note from Mr. Ellery confirming that he had settled in a distant county, his reputation too damaged to attempt his schemes in London again, living, by all accounts, a considerably humbler existence than the one he had once tried to claim through theft and threats. Grace felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the matter had finally, fully closed, leaving nothing but clean air behind it. The wedding took place 2 months later, small and quiet by the standards of the ton, held in the same chapel behind the townhouse where Julian had spent so many solitary Sunday mornings grieving parents he had lost too young. Grace wore green, not white, a deep, rich shade that reminded her of the fabric she had helped Lily choose on that first ordinary afternoon that had marked the true beginning of everything between them. Lily stood beside her throughout the ceremony, beaming with unrestrained joy, having appointed herself unofficial mistress of every wedding detail, from flowers to music, with an enthusiasm that left even the professional planners slightly exhausted. The morning of the wedding, Grace woke early, just as the first pale light crept through her window, and found she was not nervous in the way she had expected to be. Instead, a calm certainty had settled over her, steady and warm. The same feeling she imagined a ship's captain might feel finally sighting land after a long, uncertain voyage. Mrs. Pratt helped her dress, fussing gently over every ribbon and pin, her eyes suspiciously bright throughout the entire process, and Lily burst into the room twice, unable to contain her excitement, before finally being ushered away to take her own place among the small gathering of guests. The chapel itself had been simply decorated, sprigs of white and green woven through the pews, candles lit despite the early hour to lend the space a soft golden warmth. Grace walked the short aisle alone, having no living family willing to give her away, though she found she did not mind the solitude of those final steps. She had walked alone through the worst of her grief. It felt right, somehow, to walk these last steps toward joy the same way, arriving at Julian's side entirely on her own, choosing him freely rather than being delivered to him as an obligation. He watched her the entire distance, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen from him even now, months into their courtship, all his careful composure set aside for this one unguarded moment. When she reached him, he took her hand and murmured, low enough for only her to hear, "You are the bravest person I have ever known." "You taught me how to be," she whispered back, and then the ceremony began, and the rest of the world fell quietly away. Grace stood at the altar and looked at Julian, this careful, guarded man who had pulled her from a river without knowing her name, who had slowly, patiently taught her that surviving was not the same as living, and felt a happiness so complete it nearly stole her breath entirely. "I never imagined," she whispered to him during a quiet moment after the ceremony, while guests mingled in the garden beyond, "that the worst night of my life would lead to the very best one." "Nor did I imagine," Julian replied, "that riding home late from an unremarkable meeting would change absolutely everything I believed I understood about my own life." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his eyes warm with a tenderness that still occasionally caught her by surprise, given how carefully guarded he had been when they first met. "I used to believe love was a weakness, something my father's grief had proven dangerous, and best avoided entirely. You taught me otherwise, Grace. You taught me that the right kind of love does not weaken a person. It simply gives them something worth being strong for." Lily found them a few minutes later, practically bursting with excitement over some detail of the wedding breakfast she insisted required their immediate attention, and the quiet moment dissolved into the joyful chaos of celebration, laughter, and the warm, easy companionship that had become the true foundation of their small, unconventional family. Years later, when people asked Grace how she had come to marry the notoriously cold Duke of Rowan, she would smile and tell them, quite honestly, that he had pulled her back from certain death on a bridge one desperate night, expecting nothing in return. She rarely elaborated further, letting the listener assume whatever romantic conclusion they preferred. But in her own heart, she understood the fuller truth, that it was not the single dramatic rescue that had saved her, but everything that came after. The quiet mornings, the shared silences that no longer felt lonely, the steady, patient way he had taught her, day by day, that she was worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth loving completely, and without condition. In the years that followed, the townhouse filled slowly with new sounds, the laughter of children eventually joining Lily's, who grew into a confident, sharp-witted young woman that London society learned to both admire and slightly fear, much to her brother's amused pride. Grace never forgot the woman she had been on that bridge, desperate and certain the world had no further use for her, but she came to understand that surviving that darkest night had not been an ending at all. It had simply been the quiet, painful beginning of a story she had not yet known she was capable of living. She kept, tucked away in a small drawer of her writing desk, the coat Julian had given her that first freezing night on the bridge, worn soft with age but never discarded. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the house had settled and the children were long asleep, she would take it out and remember the stranger who had refused to simply walk away, who had seen something worth saving in a woman who could not yet see it in herself. Julian, for his part, grew into the kind of duke his mother might have been proud of, warm where his own father had turned cold, generous where circumstance might have made him guarded and distant. He often told Lily's children, in later years, the story of the night he found their aunt on a bridge, though he always left certain details soft around the edges, private moments that belonged only to him and Grace. He would simply say that he had gone looking for nothing in particular that evening, and had found, instead, everything that mattered. She had walked onto that bridge believing she had nothing left to lose. She walked away from it, in the end, having found everything worth living for instead. Rain lashed against the windows of the countryside manor Julian had inherited from a distant uncle, a smaller, quieter property tucked into the hills 2 days' ride from London, where he had brought Grace for a fortnight following the wedding, away from the noise and scrutiny of the city. She stood at the window watching the storm roll across the valley, a cup of tea cooling forgotten in her hands, when Julian came to stand beside her. "You are thinking of something serious," he said, studying her profile. "I can always tell. I received a letter this morning, from a solicitor in the north, representing a family I had never heard of." Grace turned to face him, an odd mixture of confusion and curiosity in her expression. Apparently my father, before everything fell apart, had made a small private investment years ago in a shipping venture that ultimately succeeded, quietly, without his name ever being properly recorded in the disaster of his other affairs. The solicitor says there are funds owed to his estate that were simply overlooked amid all the chaos and scandal afterward. That is remarkable news. It is strange news, mostly. She set the teacup down, turning the letter over in her hands. For so long I believed there was nothing left of my father's legacy beyond debt and disgrace. To learn now that some small piece of his judgment proved sound after all, that he built something worthwhile even amid everything that went wrong, it feels like being handed back a piece of him I thought I had lost entirely. Julian took her hand gently. "What will you do with it?" Grace considered the question seriously, aware that for the first time in a very long while, the choice was entirely her own to make, unclouded by desperation or necessity. "I think," she said slowly, "I should like to use it to help others in circumstances similar to mine. Women left with nothing when a father's or husband's fortune collapses, who have nowhere to turn and no way to rebuild what was lost. I know all too well what that helplessness feels like." "Then we shall make it happen," Julian said simply, as though the matter required no further debate. "I have connections enough to establish a proper fund, with your name attached if you wish it, or kept quiet if you prefer to work without recognition. Whichever suits you." "I think," Grace said, a small, thoughtful smile crossing her face, "I should like my name attached. I spent so long being ashamed of who I had become after everything fell apart. I find I am no longer interested in hiding." Over the following days, despite the persistent rain, they spent long hours discussing the shape such a fund might take, Julian bringing his considerable knowledge of finance and estate management, Grace bringing the hard, lived understanding of exactly what desperate women needed most in their darkest moments: safe lodging, honest legal counsel, and the simple dignity of being treated as capable rather than pitiable. By the time the storm finally cleared and sunlight broke properly over the valley, the outline of what would eventually become the Whitmore Fund for Widows and Orphans had taken firm shape between them, a project that would occupy and fulfill Grace for decades to come. They walked the grounds that final clear afternoon before returning to London, Grace's arm tucked through Julian's, the manor's gardens wild and slightly overgrown from years of neglect under its previous absent owner. "I never properly thanked Lily," Grace said suddenly, watching a pair of birds circle overhead, "for accepting me so completely from the very start. Most girls her age would have resented a stranger suddenly inserted into their household, particularly one their brother grew so quickly attached to. Lily has always possessed better instincts about people than either my father or I ever managed. She knew what you were within days, long before I allowed myself to admit it." So Julian's mouth curved with quiet affection. "She told me once, rather bluntly, that if I let you slip away out of stubbornness or fear, she would never forgive me. I believe she meant it entirely. She is a remarkable young woman. You should be proud of the sister you raised. I am. Though I credit you with a fair portion of the credit as well." She grew brighter, warmer, considerably less prone to running off governesses, from the moment you arrived. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the late afternoon light catching gold in his eyes. "You changed this family, Grace. Quietly, without ever intending to, simply by being exactly who you are." "You changed me first," she said softly. "I was ready to end everything on that bridge. You gave me a reason to want tomorrow, long before either of us understood what that reason would eventually become." They returned to London a week later to find the townhouse thoroughly transformed by Lily's enthusiastic redecorating in their absence. New curtains hung in the drawing room, fresh flowers arranged in every available surface, and a small hand-painted sign above the study door reading Whitmore Fund Headquarters, which Lily had apparently commissioned the moment she learned of the project, entirely without permission but with considerable pride in her own initiative. "I thought you might need somewhere official to begin the work," Lily explained, entirely unrepentant when Julian raised an eyebrow at the unauthorized redecoration of his study. "Besides, I intend to help. I have been reading about finance and legal matters all week in preparation, and I have several excellent ideas about how we might structure the initial applications." Grace laughed, pulling the girl into a warm embrace. "I would be glad of your help, Lily. More than glad." The first woman to arrive at the fund's newly established office was a young widow named Margaret Colby, whose husband had died suddenly of fever, leaving behind debts she had not known existed, and 3 small children with no means of support. She arrived pale and trembling, clearly expecting to be turned away or lectured about her circumstances, and Grace recognized instantly the same defeated posture she herself had carried through the streets of London not so very long ago. "I do not know how to begin," Margaret admitted, twisting her hands in her lap as she sat across from Grace in the small sunlit office Lily had so proudly arranged. "I have never managed money in my life. My husband handled everything, and now I find myself utterly lost, with children who need feeding and no notion of where to turn." "Then we shall begin simply," Grace said gently, "one problem at a time, exactly as I once had to learn myself." She spent the next hour walking Margaret through the practical realities awaiting her: temporary lodging arranged through the fund, a modest stipend to cover immediate needs, and the promise of legal counsel to sort through her late husband's tangled debts and determine what, if anything, could still be salvaged for her children's future. By the time Margaret left that afternoon, some of the color had returned to her face, and she paused at the door to look back at Grace with an expression of cautious, disbelieving gratitude. "Why would you help someone you have never met?" she asked. "You do not even know me." "Because someone once did the same for me, when I believed there was no one left in the world willing to help." Grace smiled, thinking briefly of a cold bridge and a stranger's iron grip on her arm. "I intend to make certain that kindness does not end with me." Julian heard the full story that evening, listening with quiet attention as Grace recounted every detail of Margaret's visit, and something in his expression, tender and deeply proud, told her more clearly than words ever could, how thoroughly he understood the significance of what she was building. "You have found your purpose," he said simply. "We have found it," she corrected. "I could not do this without your support, Julian. The funds, the legal connections, the quiet weight of your name opening doors that would otherwise stay firmly shut against women like Margaret. This is as much your work as mine." "Then let us continue building it together," he said, "for as long as there are women like Margaret who need somewhere to turn." Life settled, in the months that followed, into a rhythm neither Grace nor Julian had quite dared imagine possible in their earlier, more guarded years. The fund grew steadily, helping its first handful of women within its opening season, widows left destitute by dishonest solicitors, daughters abandoned by families ashamed of scandal, each case handled with the same quiet dignity Grace had once so desperately wished someone had extended to her. Julian, for his part, found himself increasingly drawn into the work as well, his sharp financial mind proving invaluable in structuring the fund's investments to ensure its longevity, and something in him softened further with each family successfully helped, as though every small act of rescue somehow eased a portion of the old grief he had carried since his mother's death. Grace often thought back, in quiet moments, to the woman she had been on that bridge, certain the world had discarded her entirely, certain nothing remained worth living for. She had been wrong, though she could never have known it then, standing in the cold and the dark with the river rushing beneath her. There had been an entire life waiting on the other side of that terrible night, one built not from a single dramatic rescue but from 1,000 small choices afterward, choices to trust again, to hope again, to let herself be seen fully by people who chose to stay. The Duke had pulled her back from certain death that night, a stranger acting on instinct he could not fully explain even to himself, but it was everything that followed, the patient unraveling of walls neither of them had meant to build so high, the slow, steady work of choosing each other again and again through fire and threats and family scrutiny, that had truly saved her. Neither of them had been ready, that first cold night on the bridge, for what would come next. But they had met it together, step by uncertain step, and built from it a life far richer than either had dared to imagine alone. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, Grace would walk with Julian to the same small chapel behind the townhouse where he had once grieved alone, and together they would sit in comfortable silence, no longer burdened by ghosts neither could name. The portrait of his mother still hung in the upstairs hall, but Julian no longer looked away when he passed it. Instead, he would often pause, just briefly, and Grace liked to imagine he was telling her, in his own quiet way, that the boy she had left behind had finally, fully learned how to be happy again. And on the coldest nights of winter, when the wind howled outside and the fire burned low in the hearth, Grace would sometimes think of the river, black and rushing beneath a bridge she had once believed marked the end of her story. She understood now that it had marked nothing of the sort. It had simply been the place where her true story finally began.